If you play Dungeons & Dragons in 2024, you would be excused for thinking that the current controversies that have been surrounding the game are the cream of the crop. The OGL scandal, massive layoffs, AI artwork in official books. Now this must be as crazy as it gets, right? Now what if I told you that there was a greater controversy that occurred early in D&D's life? Dramatic national spotlight legal battles, an industry war waged against D&D, factions popping up and trying to kill the juggernaut, and even a disgruntled former employee storming the stage of an award show to steal a trophy away from the company. And all of it started with that guy, Dave Arneson, who honestly you might not even know who he is. And there's a reason for that. Arneson was the co-creator of Dungeons & Dragons. But what if I were to tell you that since 1976, there has been purposeful efforts to try and cover that fact up? Who is Arneson, and why was he removed from the history of our hobby? Most importantly, what happened to him? Howdy folks, and welcome back to Delver. Today's video is heavily inspired by The Game Wizards by Jon Peterson. It is an amazing book and look into the early days of D&D and how TSR became the most powerful company of the role-playing game hobby in the 1970s and 80s. Personally, I really enjoyed the audiobook, so I would highly recommend that, but the book itself comes with a lot of photos and different documents from that time in TSR's history. It's incredible. Dave Arneson is a controversial figure in the history of our hobby. Some see him as the proud martyr standing against the growing power of TSR. Others see him as a greedy opportunist trying to mooch off of the success of D&D and _Gygax. Either way, it is important that we not forget Arneson and his influence on the games industry. Remember, he co-created D&D, but his split from TSR in 1976 and the subsequent Great War impacted the industry in many different ways. Some for the better, and some for the worse. Arneson began his story as a student at the University of Minnesota. In 1969, Arneson drove nearly 5 hours to a small gaming convention hosted in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. It was at this event called Gen Con that Arneson would meet Gary Gygax, the founder of the event. After meeting, the two began to work together on multiple different projects. Chief among them, Don't Give Up the Ship, a naval war game. Arneson loved naval history, and he saw the creation of this game as a fantastic way to push his miniature naval vessel business out into the world. In the 1960s, wargaming rules were sold for dirt cheap or oftentimes given away for free. This was done to try and inspire the consumer to try and purchase more miniatures so that they can run the game, miniatures being the bigger market at the time. Arneson and Gygax became good friends, and they began regular correspondence. Sometime later, Arneson began to adapt the rules of Chainmail, a game co-authored by Gygax, to fit into his fantasy setting of Blackmoor. However, Blackmoor was more than just a setting. It was the name of Arneson's region in the Castles and Crusader Society's Great Kingdom, a fantasy realm overseen by Gygax. He would give his close friends and peers small regions of this great kingdom where they could all rule together as lords in their imagination. And what was Gygax's realm? Well, it was called Greyhawk. Working together, the two began to develop an entirely new game, a war game with elements of fantasy role-playing. That game was Dungeons & Dragons. When the time came to decide royalties on this self-described $300 idea, the two agreed to split royalties. This would become the crux of later legal battles. Once Dungeons & Dragons had been developed, the pair pitched the idea to Gideon Games and Avalon Hill. The two companies decided to pass on it, and now Avalon Hill makes D&D themed board games. Then Brian Bloom came to the rescue and provided the funds to publish Dungeons & Dragons. And then it would be a few years for D&D to become the breakout success that it was. Years later, Arneson would reluctantly leave Minnesota to live in Lake Geneva. There, he became an hourly employee for Tactical Studies Rules, the company created to publish D&D. While here, Arneson became frustrated and anxious at the small-town lifestyle. In the afternoons, he would leave the offices and go home to work where he was more comfortable. During 1976, Arneson began to grow resentful and malcontent with TSR, with Gygax. He was treated poorly and lesser. In a letter from former employee Robert Kuntz, Arneson crossed out the president title from 𝐒𝐲𝐽 name and replaced it with dictator. This goes to show you that there was a lot of frustration directed at his co-author. On November 8th, 1976, 𝐒𝐲𝐽 announced a new employee handbook that was going to be released to the company. Under absences, it stated, employees are required to be on duty during their work hours and must not leave the company premises except on approved company business without permission from their immediate supervisor. Furthermore, a point system was put in place to punish individuals for misconduct while on the job, primarily leaving the premises without notification, an act punishable by immediate termination. On that same day, Arneson received a letter and new contract from Gary. This new contract was a revision to the employment agreement to try and stifle Arneson's ability to work as a freelancer with his old pals in Minnesota. It was also retroactive, which meant anything that he had already worked on at his tenure at TSR throughout that year was now property of the company. And this contract would continue in effect even after Arneson left the company. He was given 1 week until November 15th to either sign the new contract or resign entirely from the company. The weekend before, Arneson traveled to Minnesota with Mike Carr, his supervisor, and Brian Bloom, one of the board members at TSR. He met with his uncle, an attorney, and was told to not sign the agreement. Instead, the two created a new counterproposal to give TSR a right to first refusal for projects that Arneson developed in the future. However, the trio would arrive late in Lake Geneva on November 15th. Arneson had missed his deadline. The next morning, Arneson returned to the TSR offices. When he picked up his check for the week, he saw that he had been docked $40 of pay for an unauthorized trip on company time. Enraged, he fought back against the ruling. Carr, his immediate supervisor, was on the trip with him, and Bloom, a board member, was also on the trip. Soon after, Arneson gave the company, primarily Gary, a letter demanding that they consider his counterproposal. He gathered up his things and left the office just after 1 p.m. 𝐒𝐲𝐽, however, claims that Arneson was slamming drawers and slamming books down as he got prepared to leave the office. And then he stormed out of the building without notifying anyone that he was leaving. When he returned, he learned in a letter that 𝐒𝐲𝐽 had denied his counterproposal, demoted him to shipping, and suspended him for 10 days without pay for leaving the offices without notifying anyone. On November 20th, 1976, after many varying drafts of different sizes, Arneson resigned from TSR. After the resignation, Arneson would begin to refer to Gary 𝐒𝐲𝐽 as Egg. This was in reference to the Egg of Coot, a villain from his Blackmoor setting. Similarly, 𝐒𝐲𝐽 would begin to refer to Castle Blackmoor in the Great Kingdom as abandoned and containing a maze of monsters underneath. The two were now enemies, and the Great War was set to begin. Arneson defined this Great War as a battle of TSR against the rest of the industry. He would actively invite conflict between companies that were opposed to TSR, and he spoke frequently in interviews in magazines and other publications about his disdain for Gary 𝐒𝐲𝐽. Even after his time at TSR had ended, Arneson would be involved in a number of impactful events to TSR, D&D, and the role-playing game industry as a whole. First was his publication of the Dungeon Masters Index outside of TSR. Then, his unsuccessful creation of a competitor to D&D called the First Fantasy Campaign. The first major event occurred in 1979 when Arneson sued TSR for reneging on his royalty agreement. He claimed that all content related to D&D, including the new Advanced Dungeons & Dragons book, fell under his royalty agreement. 𝐒𝐲𝐽, in turn, began to remove mentions of Arneson as the co-creator of the game in newer releases. Animosity and legal battle continued all the way until 1981. Arneson settled out of court with TSR for 2.5% royalties on all AD&D products and recognition as the co-creator of D&D. Now, many of us know that story of the legal battle with Arneson and 𝐒𝐲𝐽 and TSR, but what many people wouldn't know is this absolutely insane event that I can find almost no information of it online. Thankfully, Jon Peterson's The Game Wizards came to the rescue and informed me about this crazy moment. Origins, like Gen Con, was a massive convention hosted by Avalon Hill. In 1978, they held an awards ceremony for the industry. D&D won 3 awards, including Best All-Time Role-Playing Game Rules. TSR had sent employees to accept these awards on their behalf, but when the final award was announced, Arneson stormed the stage and took the trophy for himself. He claimed that the trophy belonged to him, and he left the stage. It's still so crazy saying it now. Officials tried to get the award from Arneson, but he refused to give it back and instead demanded that TSR give him the 2 awards that they had already accepted. This tantrum became the talk of the convention and the gaming industry as a whole. And quite honestly, Arneson's original purpose for doing it fell flat. He was advocating, and I think rightfully so, for these awards to be given to designers instead of companies. But the way he did it just ruined his credibility. This event became a massive stain on his reputation in the industry for all time. And Arneson would never receive those 2 awards. However, TSR did receive a copy of the award that he stole. After this, Arneson withdrew a lot from the industry. 𝐂𝐲𝐧𝐭 and he reconnected sometime in the 1980s, but soon separated after 𝐂𝐲𝐧𝐭 was forced out of TSR and Arneson's projects were promptly dropped from the company. On April 7th, 2009, Arneson passed away at the age of 61. Now, whatever your opinion of Arneson is, it is a fact that he is a massive player in the creation and continuance of this hobby. He was a direct hand in the creation and development of Dungeons & Dragons, the premier role-playing game of our entire hobby. And honestly, we should strive to remember his accomplishments and his controversies equally, because discounting either is disingenuous to the hobby, the history, and Arneson himself. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you next week.